2024 has not exactly started well for Ukraine. While just a year ago it was the Kiev troops who had the initiative, now the tables seem to have turned. Now it is the Russian armed forces that are on the offensive.
Ukraine withdrew its units from Avdiivka.
The fight for the town of Avdiivka, an industrial town of just 29 square kilometers located at the gates of Donetsk, began on 9th of October 2023. And just as had happened at the beginning with Bakhmut, the Kremlin made this locality an absolutely vital objective. It gathered almost 50,000 soldiers and concentrated an enormous amount of equipment to assault and conquer this city. The casualties have been, once again, outrageous. The Russian steamroller has sacrificed thousands of men in order to achieve an objective, which, in the end, this time, it has achieved. After months of heavy fighting, the Ukrainian armed forces have finally withdrawn and handed over the town, or rather, what is left of it, to the troops with the tricolour flag. Take a look at what General Alexander Tarnavsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian forces in the region, has said.
Based on the operational situation around Avdiivka, in order to avoid encirclement and preserve the life and health of servicemen, I decided to withdraw our units from the city and move to much more favorable lines of defense. In a situation where the enemy is advancing on the corpses of his own soldiers with a 10-to-1 advantage in artillery fire with continuous shelling, this is the only correct decision.
The withdrawal from Avdiivka was also the first major decision taken by the new commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi, who took office on 8th of February. General Syrskyi is the same general who led the defense of Kiev in the early days of the war and later headed the successful Kharkiv counteroffensive. Syrskyi has thus replaced the legendary General Valery Zaluzhny, the man, the national hero, who had led the Ukrainian resistance since the beginning of the invasion. According to the Ukrainian president, after the failure of the counteroffensive in summer 2023, a booster is needed. The truth is that things between the general and the president began to get complicated when the counteroffensive failed to accomplish its main goals, and it became virtually untenable when, in November, General Zaluzhny gave an interview to The Economist in which he said that the war had reached a stalemate and that most likely there would be no major breakthrough in either direction, either by the Ukrainians or by the Russians. In other words, that this map, which shows how things are now, could remain stationary for a very, very long time, perhaps even forever. Why? Because according to General Zaluzhny, the two contenders have reached a kind of technological stalemate, which means that neither of them can have a clear advantage on the ground. And so the fighting has returned to something like it was during the First World War, an intense, agonizingly slow struggle for tiny scraps of territory. In other words, without more, and above all, much better military assistance from the West, things look bad for this general when it comes to trying to achieve the goal of driving the Russians out of the country. And of course, without clear hope of achieving a military victory, there was only one way out: negotiate. That at least is what was interpreted from the general's statement. The fact is that this interview caused a real commotion. From that moment on, Zelensky began to look for a replacement to lead the Ukrainian armed forces. And that replacement finally arrived at the beginning of 2024 with the appointment of General Alexander Syrskyi. Avdiivka is not the only enclave where things are not going well for Ukraine. The positions on the eastern bank of the Dnipro River have become a nightmare over the months. What was once envisioned as a spearhead to open the way for a Ukrainian offensive now seems to have its days numbered. In general, many of the current front lines are not at their best. Specifically, Russia is trying to gain ground with 5 offenses: in Kreminna, in Bakhmut, in Marinka, in Robotyne, and of course, in Avdiivka. Ukrainian soldiers are exhausted, morale has plummeted, and to top it off, the supply of weapons from the West has slowed down. And as long as the US Congress does not give the go-ahead, if it ever does, to the $60 billion aid package requested by the Biden administration, things do not look set to change.
Increasing European military aid to Ukraine is essential, but not sufficient to stabilize the front. If the US were to end military aid, European countries would not be able to make up the shortfall in critical military equipment, especially in terms of air defense systems such as Patriot missiles.
But why did the counteroffensive really fail? Why do things now suddenly seem to have changed so much? What does this new scenario mean for Ukraine? Is everything lost? How exactly are the war plans changing? Well, VisualPolitik community, we're going to take a look at that right now.
The punch.
Let's start by talking about the elephant in the room, the great failure of the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. During the first half of last year, there was a lot of expectation about the possibility of a Ukrainian breakthrough, especially following the great victories in Kharkiv and Kherson in the second half of 2022. Thus, pushing the Russians further back was set as a perfectly achievable goal. The arrival of Western equipment was going to make things much easier. And yes, there were many of us who thought we were witnessing a great opportunity, which in the end did not materialize. So the question is, what on earth happened? Well, let's try to put this puzzle together from the beginning. During the first anniversary of the war, Zelensky said that 2023 would be a year of victories. The head of Ukrainian intelligence claimed that they would soon be on vacation in Crimea. However, as you have seen, the result was the complete opposite.
We wanted faster results. From that perspective, unfortunately, we did not achieve the desired results. And this is a fact.
And guess what? This was something that Washington began to see very early on. On the 15th of June, just 11 days after the start of the counteroffensive, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met at NATO headquarters in Brussels with the then Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov. The meeting was also attended by important US Army commanders. Austin quickly went to the crux of the meeting. He asked the Ukrainian minister why his forces were not using all the mine-clearing equipment supplied to them in an attempt to achieve a full-scale assault in the direction of Melitopol. He also asked him why his units were not using such basic elements as smoke cover during their advances, and warned him of the mistake of not following the war plans drawn up in Washington. And VisualPolitik community, here the answer was not at all favorable. During the attack operations, the Russian defense fire made any advance practically impossible. Without air support cover, the advance would be very slow and very painful. Exactly the same thing that has happened to the Russians in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, where the slightest advance has required enormous sacrifices.
We cannot maneuver due to the density of landmines and tank ambushes.
Clearly, things were not going according to plan. And the question is, why? You see, both the US and UK militaries had conducted 8 major war simulations to devise a strategy that could succeed. Even so, everything indicates that these war games did not take into account some problems. First, insufficient training of the Ukrainian army. Just keep in mind that by the beginning of 2023, it is estimated that about 130,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been wounded or killed in action. Among them, many of the country's best units. The replacements that were trained by NATO had very short training sessions. Keep in mind that they had to be on the front lines as soon as possible. Second, problems and delays in the delivery of equipment.
We are sorry, but some of the vehicles we received are not suitable for combat.
One's an example, some German Marder arrived without radios, and some Leopards arrived with serious performance problems. In other words, they had been underdelivered, late, and in many cases with problems. Third, Russia's willingness to indefinitely maintain the human steamroller with which the Kremlin punishes its own units has been higher than expected.
That was my mistake. Russia has lost at least 150,000 dead. In any other country, such casualties would have stopped the war, but not in Russia, where life is cheap and where Mr. Putin's reference points are World War I and World War II, in which Russia lost tens of millions.
And fourth, the improvement of Russian defenses. Many in the West, including ourselves, underestimated Russia's ability to mount a proper defense. Well, once you put everything together, you can understand why the counteroffensive didn't work. The Pentagon's initial idea was to begin the counteroffensive in April by a massive mechanized frontal attack against the Russian lines in the direction of Melitopol. However, delays in training plans and weapons deliveries caused the Ukrainians to push the timetable back to early June. That was the first upset for Washington. Why? Because the Russians were improving their defenses at full speed, and obviously, almost 2 months of delay allowed them to be much better prepared. But that's not the end of it. Washington wanted the Ukrainians to concentrate all their firepower on a single point, but Kiev did not want to put all its eggs in one basket. Therefore, the Ukrainian army ignored Washington's plan and put another alternative on the table, a triple attack, towards Melitopol and Berdyansk in the south, and towards Bakhmut in the east. Their idea is that that this would force the Russians to defend too large a position on the front, which would ultimately open gaps that the Ukrainians could break through without much effort. In this vein, the Ukrainians maintained, for example, large endowments of men and equipment to try to recapture Bakhmut. The problem is that the plan did not work. The dispersion of forces meant that the Ukrainian attack was unable to break through the wall that the Russians had drawn up, following the old Soviet-era war manuals. Would the Washington alternative have worked? We don't know, but perhaps it wouldn't have either. Because what is certain is that the equipment delivered was insufficient, and as we've already said, there were many gaps. So, who knows? But pay attention, because right now things are getting even more complicated. In Kiev, there are many doubts about military supplies from the West, especially when it comes to ammunition. To maintain artillery firepower, ammunition is needed, but it is arriving in dribs and drabs. At the same time, Russia is not only managing to manufacture much more ammunition, but reinforcements are also arriving from Iran and North Korea. In the meantime,
Ukraine has received 300,000 of EU's promised million shells, Foreign Minister.
Not surprisingly, this has consequences. VisualPolitik community, as we've told you in past videos, this war has become mostly an artillery war. Well, during the summer of 2023, the Ukrainian army was launching about 7,000 shells every day. Now the shortage has caused that figure to be reduced to about 2,000, while the Russians continue to launch about 10,000, 5 times more.
The main reasons for the withdrawal of Avdiivka are to be sought in the fact that the Ukrainians probably have little ammunition at the moment. They probably have little in terms of artillery and anti-aircraft ammunition.
The problem? As you have seen, Europe pledged to send 1 million shells by 2023, but in the end, it only managed to deliver a little over 300,000. Today, despite the fact that the Russian economy is much smaller, it is managing to produce more artillery shells than NATO as a whole. And of course, this is just one example. Europe's support is very slow, and support from the United States is still on hold. So then, what can be done? Is it no longer possible to be optimistic about Ukraine? Is everything lost? Well, no, and this is exactly what has led us to a new phase of the war. One that could well be known as the Estonian Plan. Listen up.
Game change.
In early December 2023, President Zelensky himself had to acknowledge that they had entered a new phase of the war. And what exactly does this new phase consist of? Basically, it consists of taking on a much more defensive role. The idea would be to establish a kind of active defense, that is, to move to defend the front lines, instead of attempting new attacks, while continuing to selectively attack priority targets. What for? Well, you see, at the end of 2023, the Estonian Ministry of Defense published a report on how the war strategy should change in order to succeed in defeating Russia. As we already told you in a past video here on VisualPolitik, the Estonian strategy bets on developing a strong defense in 2024, with the idea of giving Ukraine and its allies time to rearm, rest the units that have been in combat the longest, train new soldiers, and develop an industrial base that will allow, among other things, an ample supply of artillery. All this with a view to a new offensive in 2025. This defense must be accompanied by an intensive use of HIMARS, the US Army tactical system, Ukrainian drones, and other long-range attack means, in order to give no respite to Russian troops. That is, to continue attacking command centers, logistics centers, the Black Sea Fleet, and even refineries and factories inside Russia with Ukrainian drones. This is the Estonian plan, and it is the one that seems to be being implemented right now. Zelensky himself is pushing the army to speed up the construction of military fortifications along the entire front line. This is something he is doing both to comply with this new plan and to slow down a possible fresh Russian offensive that could come as early as summer of 2023. Ukraine also appears to be on the verge of drafting between 300,000 and 500,000 new recruits. It has also embarked in recent months on a major effort to try to attract the world's leading arms manufacturers to the country. The idea is that they start producing in Ukraine in exchange for very advantageous conditions, equity financing, long-term contracts, zero taxes. It is similar to what it has already done with local manufacturers to boost drone production, but on a much larger scale.
We have a huge deficit of ammunition, not only in Ukraine, but all over the world. We understand that we should produce this here in Ukraine because all over the world, ammunition is running out. They are exhausted. All warehouses are empty.
VisualPolitik community, the 2025 plan is reasonable and perfectly possible to carry out, but to achieve it requires two things. First, maintaining Western support for Ukraine, and second, accelerating and increasing funding to expand the West's military-industrial base, something that House Republicans, much closer generally to Donald Trump than Senate Republican leaders, are making very difficult.
This is outrageous. It's going to go down in the pages of history. It really is. It's consequential, and the clock is ticking. And this has to happen. We have to help now. We have to realize what we're dealing with Putin. If the United States does not provide assistance, it will have a significant impact on the situation on the front. The United States is our main partner.
Let's be clear. To stop supporting Ukraine now is to do Putin, and by extension, the tyrants of half the world, the biggest favor in the world. It means no less than putting the entire Atlantic alliance at risk. What's more, it is being done at the worst possible time. Because in this video, we've talked a lot about Ukraine's problems, but Russian problems are not far behind. Yes, right now the tables seem to have turned on Ukraine, but that doesn't mean that Russia is winning by any means. Russia continues to sacrifice men and resources at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have managed to break through in the Black Sea and destroy 1/5 of the entire Russian fleet. The area defenses provided by the West are limiting the use of fighter planes, and although the Russian army maintains an important predominance in the use of artillery, it has dropped from launching a maximum of more than 45,000 shells per day to around 10,000. The Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023 failed, but Russian attempts to break through have also failed. The limited captures of Bakhmut and Avdiivka have been achieved at the cost of immense inhumane sacrifice and unsustainable losses of resources and equipment. So what does this mean? Well, once again, that the 2025 plan is perfectly feasible if things are done right. The Russian military has suffered enormous attrition, and that also shows. For a little extra effort, the West will keep the word it gave Ukraine when the country gave up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s. It will greatly reduce the military capability of one of its biggest threats, strengthen the Atlantic alliance, and send a message loud and clear to all the dictatorships of the world. Aid to Ukraine may seem like a lot of money, but it is not. It makes no sense for the West to spend 10 times all the aid given to Ukraine every year on its armed forces if it is then unable to use even a tenth of its annual budget to defeat one of its biggest threats. Not supporting Ukraine is a mistake, and not doing so at this very point in time is a historical mistake.
Ukrainians are not asking anyone to fight for them. They don't want American soldiers, or British soldiers, or German soldiers, or French soldiers, or anyone else to fight for them. They will fight for themselves. The Ukrainians only want the means to defend themselves against the Russian invaders.
But having reached this point, it's now your turn. What would you do if you were the one who had to make the decision whether or not to continue supporting Ukraine? Would you think of the Estonian plan and the Republican blockade? Leave us your answer in the comments and let's start a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, please like it and I'll see you in the next one. We're also waiting for you over on our other channel, Visual Economic. All the best. See you soon.